I want to talk today about Alaskan statehood and really the process that Alaska becomes a state and why Alaska becomes a state. And this really is going to come down really to its placement in the world and how that affects the United States. So this is the map most of us are used to thinking of as the world. We see an Atlantic-centric world with the Atlantic Ocean in the middle, and we see Europe and North America on either side of it. So Alaska's up there in the far upper corner, kind of by itself. And it seems much like the island that most of Americans thought of Alaska in going really into World War II. It wasn't much part. And you can see Hawaii also at the same time, same as space is also out here really by itself. And so this is the world we're used to seeing. Or we're used to seeing this map, which is even worse. At least that one gave us a sense of where Alaska was in relationship. This one sticks Alaska down by Mexico, and we don't even have a sense of how far it is to Alaska or where it's putting. And you can see Hawaii's down there in the Gulf of Mexico, rather than out there in the Pacific. Now, if you read closely the fine print, you can see the Pacific Ocean there. But again, this is often the only map people saw. This, though, map gives a much different perspective. Of course, the world's a globe. We can look at it any way we want, depending on the projections. The way we look at the map can really change our view. And this is the Alaska that the United States needed to consider, especially going into World War II. Looking at Alaska here, this Pacific Central world, we can see the Pacific Ocean. There's Hawaii there in the middle. And you can see the Aleutian Islands stretching out miles and miles, 1,000 miles plus, into the Pacific Ocean. You can see us kind of right there next to Russia. Again, we're 55 miles from Russia at the closest point. You can see Japan, our relationship to Japan, our relationship really to the entire Pacific world. Now I'm going to switch here to this map just because I can play with it. And you can see here, this is Attu Islands. This is the farthest point on the Aleutians. So this is in Alaska. But you can see then down here in Japan. This is about 2,000 miles. Now it depends. If you go to the farmost northern island, you can actually, from Attu to the far north of Japan, you're talking 1,300 miles. For reference, to go from Juneau, down here on the Panhandle, to Seattle, and that's not driving, that's as the bird flies, is like 900 miles. Japan really is no farther from Alaska than most of the continental United States. And so this is the world all of a sudden that the United States needs to consider going into World War II, just how close all these things are. And as we look at this, you can see here's Hawaii, and again how far these are from everything else, but yet how close they are to this Pacific world. Okay, so we can see we have a much different view then of Alaska that needs to be considered. Now Alaska in 1940, so right on the eve of World War II. So now Alaska was bought in 1867, but it doesn't even become a territory until 1912. As a contrast, Hawaii, which was acquired in 1898, becomes a territory by 1900. Now neither, though, become states until 1959. The 1940 census of Alaska put just over about 72,500 people in Alaska. Gene Potter, who was a journalist for Fortune magazine, commented that Alaska was a land without people. It was only accessible by sea or air, a very weak interstate transportation system. You could get from rail from Anchorage to Fairbanks, and that was about it. Unless you wanted to get on a boat or you wanted to get on an airplane, you weren't getting much around. There wasn't a good way to get around the state. And so Alaska in 1940 has very little resources, and one of the concerns is it doesn't have a lot to offer, but at the same time this is a very vulnerable place for invasion. For the United States, there was much concern that Japan was going to invade the United States through the Aleutians. And in fact, they actually occupy both Attu and Kiska on the Aleutians. So the only U.S. sites occupied by foreigners during World War II. And so this is a major concern that all of a sudden we need to militarize. And there was already military in Alaska in 1940, but now there's a rush that we need to have more military. We need to have a defense system because there's a major concern that this is how Japan is going to invade the United States. In addition, there is a land route, today many of us might have driven, I've driven several times, from the continental United States to Alaska, but this didn't exist in 1940. The Alaskan Highway is built in 1942. So in 1942, as they're talking about buildup, this is a concern that there is no overland way to get from the continental United States to Alaska. So the Army Corps of Engineers undertakes, and in 8 months, they complete 1,500 miles of road. They get from Dawson Creek all the way to Delta Junction. And you can see here the different chunks that the different engineering corps completed. And this is a major engineering undertaking, one of the greatest construction feats that the U.S. ever really finished because, of course, they got this done in a really short amount of time. Think about most road projects to get 1,500 miles of road done in 8 months. And that's starting in March and going to October. So October is not a good time to be building roads. They're battling permafrost, they're battling weather, and yet they get this road open by October of 1942 so that you can get military goods now overland into Alaska. And this is going to change that connection greatly. Well, it's still not a great road. It is a road, and it does give a connection. Now, as World War II ends, then we change the threat to Russia and the Cold War. And again, Alaska is going to be on the forefront because this is a 55-mile wide thing. And in the winter, there are islands that are Russian in Alaska that the water freezes and you could pretty much walk from Russia to Alaska. There's a lot of jokes about that, but the reality is that you get here on these little tips, and Russia and Alaska aren't very far away. It makes sense that Alaska would have colonized Russia first. You look at this and like, oh, okay, I can see why this dew line up here, this is the distant early warning line, and this was a satellite systems that allowed the United States and NORAD to see if any airplanes were coming in, because again, there was a major worry that Russia was going to invade the United States, and they were going to do it through Alaska. So you see the buildup of all these different bases continuing out here in the Aleutians, because again, you're still worried about the Pacific world, since, Japan had done it, as well as all these different bases throughout Alaska as a way to combat that. And this is what's really going to push Alaska over the line into statehood, is this concern for national security. Because Alaska, one of the concerns was, again, even in 1959, there's just not that many people in Alaska, and there's not much industry. Hawaii actually has a better case for statehood. They have the sugar industry, pineapples. They have a bunch of different things that give them actually a very vibrant economy that Alaska is struggling much more with, really until discovery of oil. In the oil industry, Alaska didn't have that same ability, and there was much concern that the state wouldn't be able to support itself. This McKay line is actually one of the things was like, well, we'll only admit some of Alaska as part of the state, like cut just some of it off, kind of the habitable part, and we're just going to ignore this up here. But the problem was, again, that's a major defense issue, especially when you're, in 1959, and you're worried about the USSR. And you can see this, we've labeled this not as Russia, but as the USSR, because that's what we're looking at in 1959. So this gives you some perspective about how Alaska is related to the entire world, and how Alaska fits both with the United States and in the more Pacific world, and how that is going to influence Alaska's importance to the United States. And this is going to be one of the ways that Alaska goes from finally a territory in 1912 to a state in 1959.